Welcome to the University of New Hampshire School of Law podcast, where every week our professors give legal insight on important news topics. Learn more about the law school at law.unh.edu. Today we are with Professor Buzz Scherr. He'll be discussing the new Voter ID law, New Hampshire House Bill 1264, which was just passed by the New Hampshire Supreme Court last week and deemed constitutional, and Governor Sununu just signed it into law. This is actually something he previously promised to veto. We'll get more onto that later. To start with, what exactly does HB 1264 change?
It changes the existing statute so that the definition of being a resident and having a domicile in New Hampshire is now the same. Previously, it was pretty clear that if you could vote in New Hampshire, even if you didn't meet the definition of domicile, that is, you could vote in New Hampshire even if you, for the foreseeable future, were not going to be living in New Hampshire. That's the technical piece of it. The reality was that this bill was very likely passed, at least according to some in the legislature, to make it more difficult for every student who is going to college in New Hampshire to vote. And what it really does is it effectively, if not explicitly, effectively requires them to do things like, if they have a car, register their car in New Hampshire, and if they have a driver's license, to get a New Hampshire driver's license. Those kind of things, according to the interpretation of the change, would establish that they have enough community of interest with the voting population in New Hampshire to allow them to vote. That's basically what the law did. Most simply, it made it harder for out-of-state students who are going to college for 4 years in New Hampshire to vote by requiring them to change their driver's license over to a New Hampshire one and to get their car registered in New Hampshire, the second of which actually can cost a good bit of money.
Now, to me it seemed weird that it actually went to the New Hampshire Supreme Court before it went into effect.
Yeah, there's a provision in the New Hampshire Constitution that allows either the legislature or the governor and executive council to send a bill whose constitutionality is maybe in question to get advice from the Supreme Court as to whether it's constitutional or not. The theory behind that constitutional provision, which has been around for a long time, is let's figure this out right up front. Rather than pass a law and then have it turn out to be unconstitutional.
Now, who brought it to the court?
The governor and executive council are really at the impetus of the governor. He said, I want to find out whether this is constitutional or not, because people whom he respected have been expressing concerns about its constitutionality. So he wanted to find out. And the darker political interpretation was he had come out pretty clearly opposed to HB 1264, these changes, 6 to 9 months ago. And the word was that he was having second thoughts about that. And he used this mechanism of sending it to the New Hampshire Supreme Court, hoping that they would declare it constitutional or unconstitutional for that matter, and then he would have cover to do with whatever he wanted to politically, either veto it or not.
How exactly was it ruled by the court?
The court found that the bill was constitutional on its face and as applied in a 3-2 decision. Interestingly, the three members of the New Hampshire Supreme Court who voted that it was constitutional were appointed by Governor Sununu, and the two members who voted that it was unconstitutional were appointed by Governor Lynch, former Governor Lynch. So there's an interesting side story that maybe we'll talk about later about, what does that tell us about the New Hampshire Supreme Court and its intersection with politics. But the basic opinion, the fundamental question in the case was this. Given the change I've described, is it unconstitutional in that the New Hampshire Constitution says in what Part 1, Article 11 says, all elections are to be free, and every inhabitant of the state of 18 years of age shall have an equal right to vote in any election. Every person shall be considered an inhabitant for the purposes of voting in a town where he has his domicile. So that's what the Constitution says. So on its face, it seems like putting restrictions on who can vote and what you have to do to count as having a domicile. For example, you got to register your car, you got to get a driver's license, seems to contradict, and every inhabitant of the state of 18 years of age shall have an equal right to vote in any election. So that's the fundamental issue. More specifically here, the question is, was the legislation, HB 1264, treating similarly situated voters differently? That is, was it putting an impediment in front of students that made it more difficult for them to vote, given their circumstances, than it put in front of others? The majority said yes. The minority said no. It said yes. It doesn't put an unfair burden on. It doesn't treat similarly situated people differently. It treats everybody the same because everybody has to make a showing that they're domiciled here. The minority, the two who found it unconstitutional, who said we shouldn't address this issue, we should send it back for further factual findings, and that's a question we can come back to if we decide to. Basically was saying that really the inquiry here is, are we putting too heavy a burden on certain members of the New Hampshire population in terms of voting? And that was their perspective. One way to think about it, although the minority didn't talk about it this way, one way to think about it is, to what extent is a student, a 4-year student from out of state, but who's living in New Hampshire for 4 years, share a community of interest with other voters in New Hampshire? Effectively, the majority said, well, once they start showing that they really are taking seriously their obligations in New Hampshire, like getting a driver's license here rather than having an out-of-state one, registering their car here rather than out-of-state, then we're going to include them in that community of interest called voters. Some would say, and I know I've talked to people who said this, so it's not enough that we come to the University of New Hampshire as an out-of-state person and pay $35,000 plus into the economy of New Hampshire over the course of 4 years, which would be $140,000, putting aside what we contribute to restaurants and other things. It's not enough that over the 4 years we're here, we are putting, each of us are putting $140,000 plus into the economy. That shows a community of interest in how the legislature votes, in the laws the legislature passes. Why shouldn't we have a say when we're here, even though we may well be going to another state once we graduate? So that's the question. Have they shown, you can phrase it different ways, is requiring them to register their car and get a driver's license too heavy a burden? That's one way to phrase it. Is contributing $35,000 plus a year to the New Hampshire economy, each student, is that enough to show they have a community interest in the political and policy issues that a legislature divides? And that's really fundamentally the question the court was playing with.
It seems like students are kind of in a unique situation. It's not very many other people, I'd imagine, would be in a similar kind of status where they're away a lot of the year, except for maybe like people who summer. But the people who summer in the state are more likely to vote in their other place.
The people who summer in the state don't, rarely seek to vote here. One, they're not living here essentially more than 50% of the time. If they're living here more than 50% of the time and they weren't living, say, in Massachusetts, then they might not have to pay as much taxes in Massachusetts. That's a messy little area. But, the examples the majority cited were examples like a business executive knows he's here for 3 years and knows that he's going to be transferred somewhere else. If the law stayed as it is, they would be allowed to vote in the state. Well, some would say, why not? While they're here, do you have to share in a long term the community of interest? Or do you have to share while you're here the community of interest? What does that business executive contribute to the state while he's here? So some would criticize the opinion as, and this will get to an interesting area, there was a lot more detail to sort through, like what was the real nature of the burden imposed on students by the driver's license car registration effective requirement. Were there other burdens were there other ways that they established a community of interest that was not apparent from the statute, like putting $35,000 plus a year into the economy? The minority said, and this is a technical legal slice of what I just said, the minority said, we need to find out more factual information about the kinds of things I just talked about. How much of a hassle is it to register your car, to get a driver's license? What do they contribute to the state that makes them more obviously a part of the community of interest that is voters? The minority said, we need to have a hearing in a lower court before that gathers this kind of information, and that will allow us to really do a better judgment as to whether this is too heavy a burden or not, whether they're already, regardless of driver's licenses and car registration, whether they're already part of the community of interest given what they contribute in New Hampshire. And the minority said, we shouldn't be deciding this. The court doesn't have to take the referral from the governor and council. They can say, nope, we're not going to do this. Let's wait until it gets developed through actual litigation. They did that only 2 years ago in another voters' rights bill. They deferred it and said, nope, we're not going to do it. One of the differences between 2 years ago and now is there are 2 more Governor Sununu appointments, Justice Marconi Hance and Justice Donovan on the court than there were 2 years ago. Both of them
very reminiscent of the U.S. Supreme Court at the moment.
Right. Both of them voted in the majority. What's interesting in that vein, this is kind of a nerdy law professor thing. Historically, what's been really unusual about the New Hampshire Supreme Court over the last, 37 years I've been in the state of New Hampshire, whoever appointed the justices to the Supreme Court over the last 37 years, it really wasn't predictive of how court cases came out. You couldn't really say, Governor Lynch voted, justices would vote this way. Governor Thompson's appointments would vote this way. It really was an apolitical court in that way. Traditionally it's always been that way. And this decision, it's not hard to look at it and say, are things changing? Are we now having too much, like some would say, the U.S. Supreme Court? Who appointed them have too much of a say in how they end up voting on issues? So that's going forward. That's going to be something to watch.
Now, especially for people who aren't from New Hampshire, what's the process for a New Hampshire Supreme Court judge getting on the bench? It's the conversation is kind of devolving into.
It's
very important.
It's a gubernatorial appointment.
Okay,
it's a lifetime appointment. It's totally up to the governor with the approval of the executive council. 5 members of the executive council from 5 different executive council districts in New Hampshire. They can go vote up or down. You need a majority vote of the executive council. Some governors have had advisory panels to recommend names to them. Others have not. And it's really that simple.
Okay.
Some governors have, like Governor Lynch many years ago. I think it was Governor Lynch, either Governor Lynch or Governor Shaheen, appointed somebody who had been a long-time public defender in the state, was the appellate defender in the state, a law professor here at the law school. And the first time any governor had ever appointed a public defender to the New Hampshire Supreme Court. But it was somebody who was by far the most experienced appellate lawyer in the state, and everybody on both sides of the political aisle was very supportive of it because he was such a high-quality appointment. Other governors, look at kind of how they would, many claim they look at how this person will vote on the issues that matter to me. Some people claim that governors appoint people recommended by their biggest contributors. So, as is true when any Supreme Court appointment occurs in those states whose Supreme Court justices are appointed, any number of factors that could be involved. That said, the majority of states, their Supreme Court justices are elected, which raises a whole nother issue.
Going back to HB 1264 a little bit, aside from the student vote impact, are there other impacts that are predicted with this? Like to other populations in the state?
That's the most obvious one. In terms of the number of people, there are transitional populations, like business executives are here for a long period of time, for a designated period of time. You're going to be in New Hampshire for 2 years or 3 years. There's that group. It's not a large population. People who have nursing assignments, for 2 years in New Hampshire. Those kind of people, but by far the largest population that'll be affected is the student population.
Is there any insight into how it seems like this would be an important ruling for the locals of towns where there's a big college, like your Durham, your Rindge?
Yeah, if there's less students voting, it's less of a pain in the neck for the clerks of the town. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is if students start registering their cars, they're going to, they're going to collect a lot of money because it costs a lot of money. You can spend $200-300 to register your car. That we're requiring, students, particularly those who are in college on loans, and can't afford college other than the loans they're taking out, that we're going to add that burden to them if they want to, vote in New Hampshire. Different people have different views on that. Some people just say, look, they're not here. They don't care enough about the state. They shouldn't be able to vote so easily. Some people say, hey, they're contributing a good bit of money. Let's take all out-of-staters out of Durham, New Hampshire, and see if the university even survives, and see what the town of Durham does. Those are the two extremes of the debate, but it's that kind of emotional reaction. We don't count just because we're young and we're only here for 4 years, versus who the hell are you to march in here for 4 years and turn our state upside down and then leave? That will be an endless debate.
Thank you for listening to the show. Get the back episodes of the podcast at law.unh.edu/podcast, which also has links to subscribe to the show on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and YouTube. Thanks, everyone.